Hello and welcome to Tuesday Newsday, your number one resource for the entire week's worth of VR news. Is the next PlayStation VR going to beat out current generation PC VR headsets in terms of feature set? Some newly filed patents may point to just that. And there's a company out there making a full exoskeleton system for VR, allowing you to feel a response when you do something like kick a soccer ball or someone touches your leg. Plus, it seems like the VR industry has found its real moneymaker. All that and more, let's just get right into the news. I have for quite some time written off the Oculus Quest hand tracking as purely a work in progress. So far, there have really only been a few good tech demos related to the technology, and if you've played around with any of them, it's pretty easy to see how limited the hand tracking is. Your hands and fingers are only tracked if they're within this small area in front of the headset and visible to all four of the cameras. But it's still an incredibly cool technology, and it's amazing that we got the update practically for free. However, it is an alpha, and that's also likely why we haven't gotten any real games utilizing it. But I did try one of the latest tech demos this past week, called Hand Physics Lab. So far, it's been by far my favorite implementation of hand tracking on the Quest, and if you haven't tested it out, I highly recommend that you give it a go. From dipping your hands and eggs in paint to playing with a crowbar, I gotta admit I was pretty wrong to just outright write off hand tracking as a feature too limited to be practical. Of course, it's going to be a while before we get any actual games that utilize the hand tracking feature though. It's still an alpha, and all the tech demos we've seen so far are only downloadable using SideQuest, which automatically limits the number of people capable or even willing to try them out. Plus, any sort of monetization is difficult for that platform. That isn't without mentioning though, SideQuest, the application that allows the loading of non-Oculus approved applications onto the Oculus Quest, greatly expanding its capabilities and software catalog, has recently surpassed 1 million downloads. Big hats off and congrats to the SideQuest team, of course. They've done incredible work to make the Quest a better platform as a whole. Next up are some of these new patents from Sony related to the next PlayStation VR. It would come to no surprise to anyone if Sony chose to create an upgraded PSVR to eventually go alongside the upcoming PlayStation 5, boasting far more horsepower than the now 7-year-old hardware of the PS4 that currently powers Sony's console VR headset. I mean, the adoption rate between PS4 users and PSVR has been pretty great, selling more than 5 million headsets to its giant user base of more than 100 million PlayStation 4 owners. And it's currently the best-selling VR headset to date, but let's be real, with subpar 180-degree tracking, an industry-low standard of 1080 by 960 per eye, and the limited graphical power of the PS4 itself, PSVR is definitely looking dated compared to anything like the Quest or, of course, the Index, which is far more expensive. But that may all change. These recent patents point directly to two improvements for the platform. One, which is the big one, includes full body tracking, and the other are haptic motors to vibrate the headset during movement. Now, I know that may sound really shocking. Vibrating headset is bound to make anybody sick. But a recent study conducted by Texas A&M and the National Taiwan University has shown that adding haptic motors to VR headsets significantly cuts down on motion sickness as well as disorientation felt by people. It's kind of a weird thought process, but it has been shown to work in these studies if the vibrations are properly synced with player movement. But let's get back to the full body tracking. I have for a long time pushed for full body tracking to become more of an industry standard, both in hardware and software. I truly believe that having a good full body tracked experience can be more immersive and jaw-dropping than almost anything else in VR. And I also believe that the final form of VR 1.0 will be the full implementation of full body tracking across most games and a standard among hardware. If Sony does actually implement this full body tracking technique as a standard in their next headset, but it'll also mean that for once, a console headset will be capable of something that is prohibitively expensive for many on the PC side. Of course, these are just patent filings and nothing could be coming from it, but with all the recent Sony news regarding VR technology, from the Knuckles-like finger-tracked controllers to now full-body tracking and experimental haptic headsets to limit motion sickness, maybe we should be looking a little closer at what Sony is working at. But before we get into the main topic today, that being a VR exoskeleton coming soon, I think it's time for a meme break! Oculus. There's an Oculus headset for everyone. There's the Oculus Rift S for an optimal PC VR experience, Oculus Quest for an optimal all-around VR experience, and the Oculus Go. Actually, there are just these two. And these bastards lied to me. Too bad I can't actually read that in, his voice. And now, back to the news. Let's talk about a pretty incredible Kickstarter that just came up this past week. This is the Agile VR, an exoskeleton being developed to tackle a multitude of issues that we currently have in VR, namely locomotion, full body tracking, and the lack of feedback from virtual stimuli. The end goal of Agile VR is to be able to mass produce something like a full exosuit rig for consumers that's decently cheap and accomplishes all of those tasks while in VR. Two things that the company talks about in their Kickstarter right off the bat for their future visions of the product are force feedback and motion capture using the exoskeleton. In case you don't know, force feedback differs from something like haptic feedback in that actual force is applied to give virtual objects a new sense of interactability. The easiest way to imagine this is being able to feel the equal and opposite reaction of kicking a soccer ball. If you kick a soccer ball in VR right now, which you can do with full body tracking, you're essentially just kicking the air. It's like getting Charlie Browned over and over again. If force feedback was introduced though, you'd be able to actually feel the ball being kicked and resistance would be applied. We've seen some forms of force feedback with gloves allowing you to feel shapes of objects being held within VR, but this is the first time I've seen it being mentioned on a whole body system. The next step is, of course, full body motion capture, which, as I've said before, is the next step for virtual reality in terms of immersion and gameplay opportunities. Of course, a cheap, viable, full exoskeleton that anyone can buy is quite a bit away. Right now, Mechatech is only launching the Agile VR. Exoskeleton controllers, as they call them, essentially knee braces that provide haptic feedback, a new form of walking in place locomotion, and to at least some capacity, lower leg tracking. Still though, the company is focusing on us, the consumers, which is a nice change. The project is to create something that is modular and does the most possible and is cheap to manufacture, which translates to cheap to buy, which is sort of true. You can back the project for around $200 or so, and that will come with the whole setup you need to walk naturally, I guess. Feel knee haptics and have that pseudo lower body tracking. I guess that would be kind of cool, having knee haptics to feel that arrow in the knee, but I'm really liking the idea of the company, and the end goal here is to create a modular system where you can buy the knees and then arms or back to create that full exoskeleton as the company is funded. I personally am not a huge fan of walking in place locomotion, as I find it's really distracting and I feel kind of dumb while I do it, but it's still an interesting product and I'll be checking it out more in the future. So we as PC VR enthusiasts may be getting excited over recent sales numbers, both in terms of software and hardware. I mean, the entirety of 2020 has been a constant cycle of headsets being sold out and new games breaking software sales records. Like for example, Half-Life Alyx selling an approximate 1 million copies in its first month. But what if I were to tell you that our little segment of consumer VR is likely to become just a shadow of the profits coming in from VR technology? With the outbreak of COVID, demand for virtual reality devices in the medical sector for training purposes has absolutely skyrocketed. In fact, the revenue generated in the virtual reality for healthcare segment in 2018 was an estimated $240 million. It's projected that by 2026, that number will inflate to as much as $2.4 billion. Now, you might be asking, why does this matter to us, people that just want to play Beat Saber and Half-Life 3 in VR? Well, it matters for us consumers greatly. The growth curve we've seen for VR adoption rates in homes has been steadily increasing, and we're in no immediate danger of seeing virtual reality actually flop anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that we're totally out of the clear. There really aren't that many large developers making games for VR, and there aren't that many publishers willing to risk a large investment on developing said large VR games. VR is led and shaped by smaller indie devs, and while that's perfectly fine, I think it has been proven by the giant leap of hardware sales recently tied to a single game's launch that big software does matter. If VR in enterprise and healthcare grows to a multi-billion-dollar industry, infrastructure will be built to support any VR industry in ways that we just don't have now. Breakthroughs in technology brought by said growth and competition will inevitably trickle down to consumer-level hardware, whether that's actual improvements to design or quicker and cheaper manufacturing techniques. And as headsets get better and cheaper, more people will be able to buy them, making larger developers far more likely to see VR as a worthy investment. VR growing quickly in other industries really only looks to be a net positive for VR as a whole, and even if those impacts aren't directly felt by us immediately, it certainly does have an immediate impact. Now, let's get into some gaming news. In case you've been waiting for any new info on Respawn's new AAA VR game, Medal of Honor Above and Beyond, that was announced last year at Oculus Connect 6, Respawn has stated that the game is still slated for a 2020 release date. We've seen many delays and even some recent cancellations of games due to the COVID outbreak, including Lone Echo 2 being delayed until 2021. So it's good news that the game is still on track for release this year. Normally, I'd be looking at E3 for info or more footage related to the game, but it's pretty unclear at this moment just how E3 or other trailers will be released this year, especially since those events have been canceled. Now, if you're like me, you enjoyed Walking Dead Saints and Sinners. It was kind of a shock that a franchised game and a franchise that I was pretty tired of ended up being one of the best and most immersive VR games released to date. Between the physics interactions and the story itself, it was just a flat-out good game, besides just a couple things I didn't like invisible barriers being present throughout the game, breaking that said really high immersion. Well, the developers of Saints and Sinners, Skydance Interactive, said during an AMA, quote, "Right now, we are focusing on SNS content. We loved working in the Walking Dead IP, so we would certainly be open to continuing that in the future," end quote, regarding a Walking Dead sequel. It's also worth mentioning that PSVR just got a port of the game released for it, and the Oculus Quest is going to be getting the same game soon, which is absolutely impressive to me. The game has a pretty robust physics system and intense visuals, but it's happening regardless. And I can bet that if the sales for both platforms as well as the previous sales for PC are good enough, that the sequel that Skydance is up for is going to become a certainty. Although I would really love to see this studio's talented crew work on something not so zombie related. Maybe a new IP, but that's just my opinion. I'm kind of zombied out at the moment, but Walking Dead Saints and Sinners is still a really good game, and I'll play it whether it's a zombie game or not. And now it's time for question of the week from Video Game Radio. What was my first VR headset and what was my first VR game? My first VR headset was really an Oculus Development Kit 2, also known as DK2. The first game I played on it was, believe it or not, a roller coaster simulator called No Limits 2. I saw Jacksepticeye playing it and I had to try it out for myself. I don't really recommend it, to be honest, but it did get me excited for the potential of VR. Now, in terms of my first real 6DoF headset that I used a lot, it was a CV1, or in other words, an Oculus Rift. And the first game that made me really see VR was Robo Recall back in 2017, when I got my Rift touch controllers and the game was released. To this day, I still go back to Robo Recall occasionally. It blew my mind at the time, and it's still an enjoyable title today. Don't forget to leave your own question of the week below. I may just answer yours next. Also, I'll be streaming today on Twitch, so make sure to stop by and say what's up and we could have a little VR talk. Updated schedule on that is in my Discord, where you could also find out about future VR meetups, like this one where we did the Cha-Cha slide with almost 50 people just this past weekend. I want to give a massive thanks to all of my Patreon supporters, especially my Omegas like Very Evil Shadow, Zimph, and Benji. I literally couldn't be doing any of this without you. Don't forget to like this video if you loved it, subscribe if you want more of this, and hit that freaking bell if you just can't live without it. Much love, Thrill out.